we are going to be taking out our claim evidence warrant sheet, and then hopefully each of you were able to go over the argument handout that I gave you last time, a simple yet easy way, or a simple and easy way to start looking at what an argument is. If you'll note, so we've signed in, taken our outstanding work from the front desk, and then we've also taken the outstanding handouts, which we did, and we'll under skeleton, which we did. But remember that your first main point, which is your problem's main point, is going to be due on Tuesday. This means that we need to start working on these problems. So each of you right now has a subpoint, which is great, right? The first problem, the second problem, the third problem. Hopefully each of us have all been able to start contextualizing that problem, narrowing it down so that it's one word that really fits in there, or one idea. But then we need to start to develop and build out that particular issue. And so how do we do that? Well, that's how we start to create these effective arguments. An argument, we don't have to look at as something that is, oh my goodness, so what? Do you think about arguments as being positive or negative?
Negative.
Oftentimes people look at it as being negative, right? We think of oh, I got into an argument, like it was bad and people left with bad feelings and, I don't know, torn relationships or something, or a product that you didn't want or you didn't get your refund. But an argument does not have to be something that's looked at as negative, because all that an argument is you doing what? You were arguing on behalf of what? An idea that you personally believe in. This is an opinion that you have about this idea. Now, mind you, your opinion is based upon what? Your beliefs, your values, your attitudes in relation to what have you all been doing for this topic? Starts with a re, ends with a search. Absolutely, researching. Because your beliefs, values, and attitudes, those are probably the things that you've seen in your life, that you've experienced, that you've imagined / observed / read about in your world, in your environment, in your own mind. But what we need to start to do is we also need to start to make that information clear to our audience. Now, oftentimes an argument will happen with more than one individual. That's how we think about it, not simply arguing on our own behalf. But we argue on our own behalf a lot of times and simply argue that we are qualified for a job. We argue that we deserved a different grade. We argue that we need to be a recipient of something specific. Right? So we are arguing and advocating on behalf of ourselves. But oftentimes the argument also goes two ways. There's other individuals out there. Now, although your audience will not be speaking back to you, you do have a live audience of individuals who potentially disagree with the topic that you were talking about. And like I said before, this is a give and take process of information. We are constantly in the exchange of giving and taking with our audience, because when we make claims, they are sitting there thinking, is it, isn't it? Because of the nature of persuasion. And if we're urging them to do something, people listen to that much more critically. So although the argument may be let me turn this one down now. Although the argument may be between, it may seem like it's only between you and you're asserting your argument, it is in fact being done with another individual. So we need to consider that when we begin to develop this argument. So how do we make sure that we are developing an effective argument? Well, there's some language that we want to make sure that we're getting in on as well. So the first thing is a claim. Anybody know what a claim is? Yeah.
It's just the first statement of your argument saying this is what I believe, but this is what you should believe.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of claims that are made. A claim can go by a lot of different languages or a lot of different terms, right? A claim can be called a proposition. A claim can be called a main point or a sub point. A claim could be called a thesis or a position or a framework. A claim can be a lot of things. But for each of you, your claims that you are making, your proposition is a claim, right? Your thesis is really a claim. But for each of you, what we're starting to look at within the problems is that your main point is the major claim there, if you will, and then each of you have a claim that is being made on your A's, your B's, your C's. That's what you're claiming. You are going to try to prove that that, in fact, is a
proposition.
Problem. Good, everybody. Yeah. Right. Well, it is a proposition. I can tell you that. You already problem. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are lighting that out. So the claim, the statement that you are trying to prove to be true. Okay? Then, so we have the claim, what we are proving true. And then what you have to have after that claim is something called evidence. So, for example, y'all, we did some reading this past weekend and this past couple weeks. It was called Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. Right? Do you remember that? These are called Aristotle's what?
Proofs.
Yes! She did it! It's a proof! Do you remember reading this? All right. Ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos deals with individuals' what?
Emotions.
Okay.
It's like
Belief system,
ethics.
values.
Think about their character and credibility.
There we go. So ethos is composed of two components. That is character and competence. And it is all under the heading of credibility. Absolutely. The credibility of the speaker. So it's the audience's perception of the credibility of the speaker. And then you also are going to be utilizing not only your own personal credibility, but the personal credibility of the experts and research that you are giving in order to persuade your audience. In turn, there is something called pathos. And now, y'all, what does this one deal with? Okay, good. So these are the elements of emotional appeals, right? This is how we appeal to our audience utilizing emotions. So credibility appeal, how are we going to make ourselves appealing to them in the minds of our audience? So this one has to deal with emotions. How do I bring up emotions within my speech? So it's not only how I'm able to bring up emotions. We can always bring up something sad, sure, but is that going to be helpful to my audience? Yeah.
Something relatable.
What do you mean? Tell me more. Tell me more.
The one you made us do, they were talking about your mom and everybody. Well, most people care about their mom, so they're trying to attach to it.
Okay, good. So attach it to your audience, to the emotions, to the beliefs, values, attitudes of your what? Absolutely. And where do you find what the beliefs, values, and attitudes of your audience are?
You make it relatable to them.
Yes, that's what we want to do. Absolutely. We want to appeal to them. But how?
Something general.
Okay, good. Yes, something general. Where do you find this information specifically? What did I say before? Do you remember? Okay, if you go back to your audience analysis survey at the beginning of the semester, this is a great idea, is to go back to your audience analysis survey at the beginning of the semester. That I asked you to list your top 3 American values. Do you remember this? So there's this list of values that we build into being American, right? You've been learning these values your entire life, just in case you didn't know so. They've been built into your educational system. They've been built into just our democracy in general. And they're continued in the messages that we receive. So, that being said, if you go back and you look at that and you start to see what individuals in your class value, start to see a way to connect and maybe look for information that would connect to that value, that would be bringing about or eliciting an emotion of happiness, of sad, of despair, of perseverance, of anger, right? Distrust, dissent, etc. Whatever those feelings are that we can have. And the last thing that we have is this idea, and it's called what? Logos, meaning logic, logical appeal. AKA, does that make sense? When you're like, something here doesn't work, something doesn't sound right, when we've laid out information that isn't true, then it's hard to follow an argument. So when we were talking about logos, and if you're going to remember in regard to logos here, there are 4 different types of what they call reasoning, or these lines of evidence that can be used in order to create information. And so this logical appeal is really the entire structure of, let's say you have your first main point, here's the A, all this information that flows in the A, this will need to be looked at in how that logical flow of the argument goes. The B as well. And then we look at that logic in totem and how that entire argument proves that this in fact is a problem and that something needs to be done. If you've also given us your established idea that something particular, like your speech needs to be done, then you've also let us know that. But logos, beyond just being the structure of an argument, also deals with the type of, so it usually will deal with issues of numbers, if you will, and making any types of comparisons or showing us how something is better than, worse than, better off than something else. So inside the evidence as well. Aristotle referred to all of these as proofs. There's Aristotle's proofs. Aristotle, when examining how to best, because he was the first rhetorician who said, hey y'all, you know who we should start to consider in our speaking? Our audience. Because before that, they weren't taking into consideration the audience. They were arguing from a logical flow, and if you didn't get the logic, then it didn't make sense. But if I simply said, don't smoke or you will die, eventually of a bad disease, that didn't appeal to everybody. It's not going to appeal to everybody in this classroom as well, right? Because we know that every single person is different. And simply building a speech based upon logic alone is not going to appeal to our audience. And so Aristotle said to be the most persuasive that you can, it's imperative that you build in these concepts of ethos, pathos, logos. This was done back in like 600 BC, 8 BC, 6. That being said, how long has this been going on?
600 years.
You think that it's still working? Yeah, it still works to this day. That's why we still teach it. We adapt it a little bit, we show you and expand upon it, but it has been going on for quite some time because it is, in fact, a very effective way to build in any type of persuasion to your argument to really make it go a little bit further. So when we are talking about evidence, I am not only talking about you finding outside research and sources, so yes, looking for testimony, looking for statistics, looking for supporting materials, but what we also want to make sure with that evidence is that it is full of what? Your proofs as well, that it is utilizing these elements of credibility, of emotional appeal, and of logic. Does that make sense to y'all a little bit more? So when you pick a story, you don't just pick any old story. You pick a story that's going to appeal to a college-age environment, one that has numbers that are relevant to them, that they can see working in their own life. That's where it also starts to show us this idea of character, that we are appealing to our audience, that we are showing them, oh, look, I care about you. I went through. I picked out research that you can understand, that makes sense to you. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, after we give our evidence, we need something called a warrant. Has anybody ever heard of what a warrant is? Okay, let me tell you. It is the unifying element that explains, they usually call it a bridge, so I'll just write that, bridge, that explains what the evidence proves to your proposition. If I made the claim, my first claim to each of you is, well, if you're thirsty, you should drink
Water.
Why do you say water? Yeah. Your body's what? How much water? Do you need it? Okay, you all know this. That's why it's not a big deal, okay? That's why you would think that if I answered water right there, you'd be like, okay, great. I get it. I'm logical. I'm knowledgeable. If I said, if you are thirsty, drink. Now what happens?
Would ask why.
Yeah,
Okay.
or probably unethical.
Right, okay, so good. This claim now, you're starting to wonder, wait, what? I've never heard of this before. And many of you may not have heard of the topics that you're talking about before, right? Like, wait, if I'm, right? Here's this issue that's been going on. I thought I knew it one way for a long time. Oh, this is an interesting claim that you're making. So if I say, if you are thirsty, drink whiskey. Each of you said, why? I'm confused. So what we need to do is we need to provide us a little bit of evidence as well, right? So what I could say is something like, and let's just say like Forbes, 2019 study from, 200, what am I doing Forbes? We'll do, let's see, medical research. Okay, let's just pretend I had some great medical research study from 2019. And then what I would do is I could say something like, this study when people drink whiskey after an hour of exercise, they had replenished 90% of their electrolytes. And IGHTS, just go with it. ITS, I realize that's based on. All right, now what? What's his evidence say?
That it may be healthy to consume whiskey after an hour of exercise.
Okay, now, typically in an informative speech, that is what you would do next, right? Remember that any type of information, we never let the citation stand. We have to explain it. In an informative speech or in an informative paper, you would simply tell me what this quote means, right? You would explain it a little bit further to illustrate the idea for the example. Now, what you need to do, instead of explaining it, because we may not need explanation of that quote, what we need is for you to reason with that information. How did you draw to a conclusion that we should drink whiskey because of this claim? What does it have in it that says thirsty whiskey? Does it directly say that?
No.
It does not. It does not say that if you drink whiskey, you will not be thirsty, right? Does it say that? No. Therefore, what does this quotation in fact mean? What does it tell you about the ability to drink whiskey for thirst? What do you maybe need to explain to your audience one step further? They may not be aware of the unstated information that you have in your own head. Because each of you know, do you know what electrolytes are?
It's like Gatorade.
Uh-huh. What does it do?
It's for hydration purposes.
Electrolytes
Replenish.
the important we should say chemicals, right? Like the chemicals that you lose. When you exercise or when we lose electrolytes, we become dehydrated, right? And the potential for dehydration is serious, right? And so if we can, in fact, reclaim some of our electrolytes, in fact, 90% of them, we can start to look at whiskey as an alternative to potentially water as a form of hydration for one's body, right? So we may need to explain what this idea of electrolytes were, what 90% means. Does this make sense to you all? What does the water do? Maybe we could even make a comparison. In contrast, water only does 20% of your electrolytes. So oftentimes people will choose it as the first. But whiskey does 90%. And although you may need to follow up with some water, a shot of whiskey can, in fact, help your thirst. And therefore, if you are thirsty, an idea, if you can, and are healthy and are 21 and over, right, you can have some whiskey to start off. Does that make sense to y'all? That it may be a different alternative, something that we've never explained before. But we do not want you to simply tell me what this quotation says. Instead, I want you to tell me what that evidence means. Oftentimes, it makes sense in your head, but it may not make sense in the mind of the audience. And so you need to walk us through how you arrived at the conclusion you did in that warrant. So how did you arrive at this particular conclusion? Does that make sense to y'all? And so what you each are going to, if you want to go back then, and let's look at this handout a bit together. Woo. And what we want to see here is it's claim evidence warrant, claim evidence warrant. I'm going to walk y'all through the idea, and I'm going to, in fact, leave this up, and then we're going to take a look at an example here. So claim. In this case, for your problems, it is going to be the A's and the B's and the C's. All of these subpoints will be written in full sentences, which you know, that reflect the purpose of the main point, i.e. problems, reasons, solutions. So in this case, for your problems, it's going to lay out the claim. And then you're going to ask, do I need an explanation of that problem, or do I need to prove it with evidence? So, for example, if your claim and the problem, the language, is a little bit technical, so right, that A, B, C maybe is the problem itself technical that wouldn't be understood by the audience, you may need to explain that in a bit more detail. If not, then you can go straight into the evidence portion of your building out your argument. So after you lay out the claim, now I am not going to tell you this is a 1, this is an A, this is an I, this is an A. I can't tell you that because I don't know what your individual speech is, so I don't want to break it down by points or subpoints beyond this. I'm simply going to say it's claim, evidence, warrant. And as long as you know that you have a claim, you have an evidence, and you have a warrant continuously going, you are in good shape. Does that make sense to y'all? So wherever the A's and the B's and the 1s and the 2s line up, it's up to them. So let's look at the second piece of evidence. It's really what we've gone over here, right? Why would you need an explanation? So it depends upon your audience, knowledge, and disposition for our topics. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. Go to that evidence should be down a little bit more, the explanation. Okay, so if you're looking about, I was asking, why do we need an explanation? That's above. It depends on your audience's knowledge and or disposition toward a topic. Remember, if they're angsty about a topic or they're not knowledge about a topic, you may need an explanation. But if you need an explanation, give ones in your own words or in ones of an expert. That's, in fact, where you could use an informative definition or description if you wanted. But if you don't need one, go directly to your evidence to prove that, in fact, the problem you suggest is a problem. That is going to be your overall goal here. And utilizing a variety of support coming from ethos, pathos, and logos is going to be important. Have you noticed that ethos, pathos, and logos are not independent of each other, but instead they work together? So in any quotation, although maybe it may be an expert study, you think, ooh, logos. It may also have an element of credibility because the expertise is there, so you get the ethos. But then maybe what we need after that is to go further and explain a little bit with an emotional story follow-up. If we already have the numbers, then maybe we put an emotional story to go along with it to really solidify and show and demonstrate. But remember that once you give a problem, you can't leave it sitting there. You must prove the severity of that problem and what that problem is going to lead to for your particular audience. So laying that out, yeah.
I think that in that video, Chris Cox, with the NRA, he did a really great job of pointing out the problems, like, if you don't do anything or something like that. He had a really great speech.
Good.
I was on topic with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And did you all go back? Did you do the listening and then the reading? Did you notice anything different?
Yeah, so with the speech, the pathos appealed to you more, but reading it, you didn't really get that feeling because you're using the more logical side of it.
Perfect. And that's really what I want you all to know, is that pathos is a very easy thing to pull over on people, especially in the moment. You're like, oh my God.
Especially in an environment where everyone is...
And when you have like a partisan environment
Yeah.
where it's like all mob mentality, right? Same ideas. So you're like, yes, right? But the idea here is that we want to make sure that when we read a speech, rather than watch it, it's why I always read a speech. Because the first initial viewing in 5 minutes can appeal to something, and we are oftentimes moved to appeal here in listening before we do here. Because logical arguments are a bit mathematical. It's why if you took logic in philosophy, it would be all equations. So that is why, because it takes us some time. That's why I always say to read through an argument, because that is where you will be able to poke holes in something and start to acknowledge, have they even made an argument, or have they simply been appealing to my emotions? And we'll go over that Chris Cox one a bit more in class as we continue, which is great, because there's a lot of elements to that where we're going to go over it when it comes to fallacies, because it's a really easy way to start looking at fallacies. Because in 5 minutes, what can you do to get people on board? Whoop! You just have to start maybe making some grand statements too, right? Okay, good. So we'll look at that as well. Then what I want to make sure is that your evidence you're giving is reflective of the problem. Go back and check yourself in the work. If this evidence is not working to explain the problem, if it is not directly related, like I said before, is this about Uber and Lyft? If it isn't about Uber and Lyft, don't use it, because it may not have that exact type of relevance of information. So making sure that you are giving and providing a specific amount of information, right? And then, and when I say evidence, then we want to go ahead and give some kind of explanation. Go into describing and explaining what does that evidence mean, and that's our warrant. So it says don't just repeat what the author is saying in that evidence. We get that. Now it's time for you to tell us what that evidence means to you. And you will need to make a clear bridge, for the audience to see how your proposition comes clear through the claim and the evidence you just laid out. So what we want to make sure that we are doing is that, you are laying out that type of description and explanation. Is it going to be in only one statement? Maybe not. Your warrant may need like 3 points to explain it, and that's fine. Do I need to only have like one piece? No, you may need a couple different pieces of evidence depending upon the severity. Remember, we need to prove it. So when we are going back through and we are working on this evidence, and the warrant, making sure what does it mean? How can I explain this best to my audience? What can I say to them? Now, this is the issue with your solution here. So everyone, this is an important part to pay attention to. If you remember from our drinking and driving speech, so no drinking and driving, the first one is the problems, right? We established that the first problem with drinking and driving was potentially this idea of accidents, right? And then what I've done here is I've provided you with some evidence that accidents are pretty darn bad, and then I provided you with a warrant that suggests that these accidents are in fact happening and they are a problem. Then, what the alternative to do is to bring up some type of solution. We had here accidents, death, and DUI. Your solution of not drinking and driving is only one particular thing. If I don't drink and drive, all of these problems go away. Right? It is a very simple action. You know that the one thing that you have to do is not drink and drive. Yeah.
Would you ever consider putting in solutions also preventing other people from drinking and driving?
I think that those could be both and. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, when I give the speech to not drink and drive to my audience, they then too would hopefully take on that same attitude, value, behavior to suggest those to other people. Is that what you're saying? Okay. At the end of this paragraph, you simply would need to remind us in the warrant, as it says here on sentence. So we need to make a last statement that urges our audience to take action. So it says, if you have a proposition that will solve all of your problems by implementing it, like not drinking and driving, you can either go back and put in more or move forward. But because, for example, I would say something like, so don't drink and drive, right? We would look at these accidents. There are these accidents that are going on. We know that these accidents can be prevented by a simple step of not drinking and driving. Therefore, I urge each of you to not drink and drive, period. However, if you have a policy, if your proposition is suggesting that we need to do something different, maybe something that isn't a catch-all. So how many of you believe you have a catch-all speech? Matthew, yours is?
Vaccines and why you should vaccinate.
Okay, and if you vaccinate, that will take it away?
Yeah.
Okay, is that a point of contention, though, that believes that you, in fact, yours is, because it's already been proven, right? Like, throughout time. You get a polio vaccine, you're not getting polio, period. Fantastic. So yours could be simply to vaccinate. That's it. Just that statement that needs to be done.
Oh, mine?
Mhm.
To sign up for the bone marrow registry.
Oh, sign up for the bone marrow. Yep, sign it up and sign it up. However, this is the only thing. Many of you wanted to talk about the benefits or the pros of your particular topic. If you have a speech, and usually that's a different way to look at it too, we don't need to look at the pros of drinking and driving. We already know that it just is covered, right? The pros of vaccination, not dying, great. Not getting sick, good, okay. Like all those things are important, but we don't need to prove that doing one is going to make it better. If you want to show the benefits and how it's going to assist and how it is going to help, that is where you come in next. So if yours is not a catch-all, you must then take the next step. And what you can do upon this accident is you are going to go in and you are going to give yet another claim. But now this claim is where we are going to lay out the benefit of our claim. So we would say something like, if implemented, right, the policy will take away the accidents. But then what do I need to do? I don't need to just say it's going to work. I need to prove what? Okay, so I need to give you evidence, right? And that's what it says here, evidence. This is where you are going to give evidence, more than just that your proposition will help. You don't want to simply say, so do it because my proposition's awesome. No. Instead, you need to give evidence of this policy working. Does that make sense to you all? So the policy working, how is it now actively working, or how has it worked? Now, you may not have that evidence because it may be something that's been hypothesized about, right? If we're talking about nuclear energy and implementing nuclear energy, we haven't had like nuclear energy as a predominant source. Let's say something like that. So what we're going to need is we are either going to need experts who can tell us that in fact it is going to work if we haven't yet to prove it, or you are going to need to make an analogy, and that you can do that for proof as well. Meaning, has this taken place somewhere else in the world around us? Has this, I don't know, in some way, shape, or form gone on, and by implementing this nuclear energy, they have seen a reduction in that issue? Does that make sense to y'all? And so what you're going to need is proof that in fact yours will reduce, that it will make it easier, that it will make it better. Then you explain that again with a warrant, right? Explain to your audience how you see that making it better, and that's when you draw to a close, and that's why we must do it. So the cool part about this structure is you'll lay out a problem. You'll lay out that it is, in fact, a problem. You'll remind your audience as to how to see that as an issue and as something that needs to be acted on. And then you will say, with my proposition, right, and this is all under your A, with my proposition, you will be able to do blank. It will reduce this. Then we will provide evidence that says that's true, either through that we've seen it, or we can provide experts or an analogy that suggests that doing it will in fact help. So something that we can't necessarily see for the future, but it's like we can hypothesize, or economists can hypothesize, psychologists can hypothesize. You can make a comparison between a psychology study and potentially individuals taking action, right? So we can always make these different types of comparisons with our evidence. So what I want you to continue to do over the course of the next couple days is at least try to get up your A and your B and your C, right? Because that's what you are going to need to be turning in on Monday, your problems. So remember, you only have to have 2 problems, but you can have 3. Each, for example, this would be main point number 1. This would simply be the A of that problem, making sure that that is done. And then once you finish this, you go back and you repeat it for your B. Does that make sense to y'all? So seeing how long that goes and how it gets built in is going to be up to you. I'll go ahead and send out a couple examples of both how one that has the catch-all solution and the other that has the benefits within the solution for you to see how that is laid out. But otherwise, keep an eye out over the next couple days for an email from me with feedback for your particular structure. I am going to write on the paper, and if you can't understand what I wrote because of my penmanship, you go ahead and you send me an email. Don't let that just sit there. Let me know, because on Tuesday this will be due. The other thing is that if you're having an issue or you're having problems or anything, please just say, hey, Amanda, on Tuesday, could we maybe stay after class, make an office hour? Because I will have office hours at the 11 o'clock hours on Tuesday. Or if you wanted to come before class, remember the 7 to 8 option is always open for you. So keep that in mind as well, okay? And if that's I don't understand, I'm not walking through it right, I will do it for you. I'll bring my computer, we'll walk it through together. All right, Smart Cookies, have a kickin' weekend. I will see y'all soon.